Hello, it's Aaron Wren. Welcome back to the podcast. Again, I have a very special guest today, great guest, Jon Askonas, who is a professor of politics at the Catholic University of America in Washington. He wrote an interesting article for Comment Magazine a while ago called Building a Future in the Face of the Apocalypse. Just the title alone, I think, is interesting. There's a link to that in the show notes. And so I asked him to join me today for a podcast to discuss it. By the way, this magazine is Comment, not the neoconservative journal Commentary. It's a great Canadian little magazine published by the Cardis Institute and edited by Ann Snyder. So, Jon, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You wrote two things that really struck with me. One is, it used to be that young people were the most optimistic sector of society. Now they're almost the most pessimistic. And secondly, that technology used to be seen as taking us to a glorious future, but now it's basically viewed as taking us to the destruction of humanity in some cases. What happened to push these shifts?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. The first, I think, is based on, well, in some ways, I think it's the same kind of series of events, which is a realization, beginning, I think maybe you disagree, and we'll talk about that, beginning with the atomic bomb, accelerating through a series of nuclear crises and environmental crises in the 60s and 70s. The growing sense that technology was growing faster than man's capability to master it, man's ability to actually control it, that it was leading to unintended consequences that threatened to sort of destroy the ecosystem, destroy the environment, destroy the earth. And that feeling took a number of forms, but I think it was for the first time, a group of young people became convinced that they were living at the apex of history, that life would be worse for their kids than it had been for them, and that was tied to the potential of technology. That we needed to do something, but the only way to avoid that was to back away from the power of technology. So there's a great website called, I think it's called, like what the hell happened in 1973.
WTF happened in 1971.com.
Sorry, WTF happened in 1971.com. That just shows the number of these inflection points. And I think the creator of the website has in mind like Nixon taking us off the gold standard. But really, I think it's kind of a concatenation of global crises, of which the gold standard was absolutely a part, that lead to this shift, which we still have not recovered from.
Yeah. It's interesting. You allude to this, and one of the things in your article that you kind of harken back to is the atomic bomb, and I think you referenced the film Oppenheimer and the deep ambiguity of Oppenheimer. There was actually an opera made about that as well, which was
Dr.
very
Atomic
good.
by Jon Adams.
Dr. Atomic by John Adams.
At the Chicago Lyric
yeah,
opera.
very good. It's got Batter My Heart or whatever it is, a great opera in that, aria in that.
Aria.
And so there's I think it was a great, there is a sense that like the atomic bomb really did give people the idea that like, wow, we could destroy Earth. But it's interesting, if you look at the post-war era, it was an incredibly optimistic time. Suburbanization, the Jetsons, there was almost this idea of a futuristic society, the mid-century architecture, the streamlines, all that stuff that's just incredible. I live in a mid-century house, and the optimism of the mid-century, even the mid-century kitchen, is amazing. It's really, that was the era in which technology really did truly, at scale, transform American life. You hit on something else. To me, there's something about the counterculture that really represents the moment in which people start to question it. And I think the counterculture, although it didn't originate necessarily with the boomers, really it was something about the boomers who came of age in this glorious world of technology, unlike their parents who lived through the Depression and World War II. they lived in this era of greatness. And of course, it's a slightly different era, but what the French call the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious decades of France. And then all of a sudden, yet we have this massive environmental degradation. People didn't live through the transformation that refrigeration gave us. They didn't live through the transformation the auto gave us, and they saw the downsides. And I'm wondering what you think about this idea that there's a generational component to this. Because if you think back about it too, like to me, is like one of the things I think conservatives get wrong is they view the counterculture as very liberal, when in a sense there's a very conservative element to the counterculture, which is like we need to get back to human scale, human technology, as opposed to this industrial dehumanizing technology.
Well, I don't know if we really disagree. I mean, I want to point out a couple things about that moment. The First World War really introduced this sort of sense of this technological destruction, right? But it's the Second World War and the atomic bomb that I think places that view of technology very close to the heart of many parts of elite culture. I think it's the two, and the flip side of the coin is sort of we live in a brave new world. We live in a world in which new technologies of control, including control of humans, are required precisely because of our capability to destroy ourselves with things like the atomic bomb. And you see that's reflected in art and literature and other parts of elite culture, as well as seeping into popular culture very shortly after the atomic bomb.
If you've ever seen Adam Curtis's documentary Century of the Self, he's got a great episode on like therapeutic, and this is the Paul Gottfried view of the world too, is like after World War II, it's like, and Nazism, we have to eliminate the authoritarian personality. We cannot allow the deep hidden forces of the id buried within to ever come to the surface again. Even the film The Forbidden Planet is like that. The idea of there's this evil hidden in the id of the human heart, and therefore only the most rigorous enforcement of the superego from outside and this therapeutic reconstruction of society can prevent the absolute destruction of humanity.
Yeah, and I touched upon this a little bit in one of my New Atlantis essays, An America of Secrets. It was really two World War II technologies that mandated the creation of a permanent national security bureaucracy in America, the atomic bomb and electromechanical cryptography. And of course, they're both connected to each other. So I think that there's a sort of structural change that takes place. The other thing I would say is, in 1945, the United States has the atomic bomb, right? And there's a very durable nuclear advantage the United States has well through the 1950s. And then you have, the Soviets beginning to A, catch up, and B, undertake actions to kind of create mutual deterrence, mutually assured destruction, leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so, you think about formative events, the boomers who were, in their 20s in 1968, you were 12 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Very formative time. And so I think that this sense of we're going to destroy ourselves, we have to do something different, that is part of the countercultural idea, is very much tied to the advent of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I grew up in the 80s and 70s and 80s in school, and we didn't do, I think, nuclear drills, but there was certainly, I remember seeing the film strips of like nuclear war. Like nuclear war was like a big deal. It's like, I didn't live my life in fear of the apocalypse, but the Cold War, there really was this idea that any day the Soviets could launch, and it could happen. Yeah, so it certainly affects people's lives. I want also, another thing that gets me, I do think there's something about the boomers and their experience, and our world is still a boomer world.
Yes.
I think it's the boomers world, and we're just living in it, unfortunately to some extent, and maybe in the next 10 to 15 years that will change. Technically, to me, I think of the boomers. To me, like the spiritual heartland of the boomers is not the generational definition of the boomers, it's really the 1940 or say 42 to 1955 birth years. Because, Joe Biden is a spiritual boomer. He's
Yeah,
not really,
yes.
he's not really a silent generation guy. He's not Pat Boone. He's not people like that. Those are very different, or Richard Lugar, different guys. And it really struck me, I was reading your article, I couldn't help but think of Peter Thiel's From Zero to One.
Hmm.
And he did this 2x2 matrix of the idea of an optimistic future or a pessimistic future versus a definite and an indefinite. And a lot of things, if you go back to the optimistic era, it was the era of the definite optimism, what he called definite optimism. We're going to accomplish X through technology. This is what we're going to accomplish. We're going to build an atomic bomb and defeat the Japanese and the Germans. We're going to do this. And they did it. And that produces a sense of optimism. He says that with the boomers, we ended this idea of sort of indefinite optimism. The future's going to be good, but we don't really know what the future's going to be. It's just going to be good. And maybe the younger generations have some sort of indefinite pessimism. This idea that like we don't know what the future's going to be, but it's going to be bad. Is there anything related to this idea of like generational perspectives of this Thiel matrix? I'm interested in what you think of that.
I think there's an interesting question of like which not only Teal on the right, but also someone like Mark Fisher on the left. When did the future sort of begin to recede before us? And I think I do agree that it's somewhere around in the 1960s, 1970s. Part of it was, I think, the sense that the great institutions that had actualized these visions came to be seen as oppressive by nature. And so a lot of what you see, for example, in the kind of early internet computing paradigm, books like Linklater, is an attempt to kind of instill the counterculture at the level of technology through networking, right? Actually having a different organizational paradigm embedded in what became to be the internet, right? And the technologies preceding up to and preceding the internet. They saw this is actually my next essay in New Atlantis is kind of on this subject. They saw a way of organizing society that was emergent, that was kind of peer-to-peer instead of descending from these sort of hierarchies of discipline and control. And I think when you lose, there's a lot of goodness that came out of those ideas, but what you lose is the ability to kind of execute at scale. You cannot execute at scale without hierarchy and without kind of singular vision. And that was, I think, part of the unintended side effects of deconstructing and undermining these sort of institutions of American life, which were sort of rigid, and you had the man in the gray flannel suit and all of that. So I think that is one part of it. No, but I confess, I certainly is the case that a positive visions of the future become increasingly scarce. We become increasingly able to better able to imagine sort of negative, destructive possibilities than constructive ones. Although perhaps this is just a return to the historical norm, right? I think periods of definite optimism are actually very rare historically.
I'm just, as you were saying this, I was thinking about it. Everybody today likes to say that the internet has really broken the embargo of the manufacturing consent model of mass media culture, mass American culture. But there's almost a sense in which the countercultures figured out how to do the same thing. And part of it is we got to see the man behind the curtain in the CIA and the MK Ultra experiments. I mean, our definite future is mind control. It's using electroshock therapy and LSD to brainwash people into doing our bidding. And that stuff really happened. That's not a conspiracy theory. Like, there were definitely people doing bad stuff. Whereas if you go back to even like the Cuban Missile Crisis, think about John F. Kennedy, incredible philanderer, many things going on, and yet nobody knew. Or was it, maybe, no, I don't know if nobody knew, but it wasn't reported. It wasn't in the public consciousness. And with the counterculture, something happened that broke the embargo on what was really happening. And people could see the Pinto was not safe. People could see that, wow, the CIA is trying to brainwash us. And like what McNamara is saying about Vietnam ain't true. It's like, I do think there is something to like this. I think there's so much to this idea of like we think that everything's new today, but there's nothing new under the sun. How did this stuff get into the bloodstream in ways that it couldn't before?
Yeah, I don't know that I totally agree with you in this.
Okay.
I think we project backwards the rapidity. Many people think that what's unique about our era of the internet is sort of this peer-to-peer connectivity. And I don't think it's true at all. It's actually deep search of massive data. That's what's unique about the internet. Boomers did not have that. The counterculture did not have that. So when you develop, if you go back and read, the countercultural figures in their own terms, you see a deep hermeneutic of suspicion and maybe even paranoia about the man, a lack of trust and legitimacy in these institutions. It's not being infilled by high quality anything. It defaults to rumor and to
it's just paranoia.
It's just paranoia.
And they got lucky. Some of it was actually true.
Some of it was true.
Sort of like Alex Jones. Some of what Alex Jones said about your TV can watch you and listen to you and report it to the NSA. That actually turned out to be true, but it wasn't actually based in any fact when he said it.
Yeah, and actually, I think it's not surprising that some rumors turn out to be true because some rumors turn out to be, from actual people right? And I do think what you have beginning in the 60s, and it's really the Pentagon Papers that kind of open the floodgates, and then you have the Church Commission, is you have the official revelation of government secrecy. And that is really shocking to people, and that sort of drives, I think, some of the paranoia in the 1970s, sort of the great come down from the Summer of Love. And part of our challenge today is that the security state keeps getting bigger and bigger, and so the revelations continue to get more and more shocking.
Right.
And it's harder and harder to keep secrets. But I think we project some of this experience back onto the counterculture. I think they were much more in the dark about "quote unquote" the truth. And it was, but what they shared with us is the kind of paranoia and suspicion of the kind of establishment narrative.
How much do you consider the way that they viewed the world to be similar or different than how the way young people today experience the world? This pessimism you're talking about, is it similar? Is it a new kind of thing?
I think if you look at it's sort of cheap psychology to do this, but you want to look at what are the childhood development environments in which people are growing up. And the boomers, they experience their childhood development, speaking very broadly, as sort of oppressive. But the flip side of that coin is they grew up in a high trust society. They grew up in a society in which they had a fair amount of agency. They grew up in a society of economic growth and expansion and scientific growth and expansion. And so these kind of cultural figures, people like Ken Kesey, Stuart Brand, they have a lot of agency. That was just the saying now, like you can just do stuff, right? That's sort of the in some ways the countercultural motto. There's a lot of self-organization, a lot of drive, a lot of agency. But then ends up kind of getting moth-eaten in the 70s by drugs, basically, which we're kind of seeing today. Whereas I think the kind of young people today, not only do they have an inbuilt pessimism around climate change and AI and population growth, or crash, or both, but they also they grew up in kind of with helicopter parents and snowplow parents. They grew up constantly surveilled by every kind of institution. There's no chance of starting over. I mean, one of the kind of paradigmatic experiences of the counterculture was running away from your small town in Indiana and going to San Francisco and kind of starting a new life there. That's functionally impossible in the society we have today. So I think that sort of feeling of stuckness, which characterizes many young people today, I think it has a real social basis.
Yeah, well, our technological society, I seem to recall reading I wouldn't swear this is the exact date, but it's like even up until the 1970s, there was no national credit reporting. So you could literally skip town and sort of establish a new identity in a new city, and nobody wouldn't know you were a deadbeat. And like this idea of just moving to another part of the country and that your history wouldn't follow you Like, we don't even think that that's possible today, but for other
Yep.
people, it was possible. You could just do a lot of things here and go somewhere else and create a new life. And like every time we see somebody who successfully did that today, we're like, wow, that's kind of weird. How did that happen? How did that guy pull that off? You know?
Yep.
One of the things that I do notice about today's world is there does seem to be a bifurcation. There's a lot of techno. Oh, looks like we lost him, and we'll see if he comes back here. That's all right. Again, I just will I get him back in. Here he goes.
Sorry,
Not
I
a
was trying to
problem.
figure out the recording
Not a problem.
issue.
It's not a problem. One of the things that strikes me today, there does seem to be a bifurcation in people's thinking. And just last weekend, I think it was, Elon Musk caught his Starship booster on the first attempt in the chopsticks in the air. And
The Mechazilla, that's right.
it was just unbelievable. There's an unbelievable magnetism around what Musk is doing. And because he's like a throwback to the definite future guy. We are going to make human species multiplanetary. Stage 1, colonize Mars. And everything he does is oriented around that. And we're going to create a rapidly reusable rocket. Maybe it's not possible, but that's what we're going to do. We're going to do this. And so many people are inspired by it. But only some people. And there is kind of a gendered reaction, there's political. But I think even apart from the politics, there's this difference. You can see it in AI. I think the AI debate really did this. There's the people who think of it as the effective altruist, who are like very like, this thing's dangerous. We got to regulate the heck out of it. We got to have a kill switch. We got to put it in the box. Skynet's coming to life. And then the techno-accelerationists, this kind of reactionary group, and somewhat reactionary in that they're reactive, I guess. We have to have effective accelerationism. The Mark Andreessens of the world. We have to accelerate technology, not retard technology. And I feel like there is like a real bifurcation of like how people view technology. Do you have any thoughts on like what's going on with that?
Well, the it is hard for me to kind of to mentally model someone who is not just thrilled to their core about the starship being caught by Mechazilla.
Yeah.
Very hard for me to understand the theory of mind there. Well, look, I think there's one view which I'm sort of sympathetic to, which says the world. I can understand. I shouldn't say I'm sympathetic to it. I'm not very sympathetic to it. The world has real, serious, complex problems, and we need to, work together as a species to address them. Things like climate change, and instead, we have very rich oligarchical billionaires who are playing with their rockets instead of, helping us solve climate change. I think it's basically, wrong 6 ways to Sunday, but at least there's a kind of coherence to it. The one I just don't understand is the kind of indifference to it. Or people who, I do think it's a bit of an IQ test whether you are in awe of Elon Musk's ability as an entrepreneur. Like you can have whatever kind of opinions about his politics, personality, or whatever, but like absolutely extraordinary, technology creator, world shaper. And then you have people who really will say things out loud where other people can hear them, along the lines of like he's not that smart or his dad was
He
rich
had
or
nothing
whatever.
to do with Starship. I always hear that.
Yeah.
He had nothing to do.
And
He just hired a bunch of rocket scientists.
Yeah, and it's just. It just goes to a fundamental. Well, actually, there might be deeper criticism here, which is, when the counterculture became the culture, basically all the people running all of our I bet every single cultural institution until very recently, perhaps of any importance, was run by a counterculture boomer. There was this massive handing over of the reins in the beginning. Sometimes they started these institutions like Lucasfilm. Sometimes they took them over like Disney by the 80s and 90s. But the whole spectrum from lowbrow up to the creative director of the Met whatever the commanding heights of culture. They're all boomers. And I think intrinsic to that is the kind of, if you can dream it, you can do it world, sort of the world of pure imagination. And the idea of hard material constraint is sort of antithetical. Let's go to the notion of indefinite optimism. The constraints imposed by material reality, they're not interested in that. And we had a technological paradigm with computing and Moore's law that was in many ways not subject to, or seemingly not subject to, this kind of hard constraints. And so I think that then the result is you have generations of cultural formation and education that just give short shrift to the difficulty of doing things and the importance of protecting institutions and people capable of doing things. Um, yeah, and there's probably another number of other elements that are related to that.
Yeah, it is. There is something weird about it. But a lot of people. You mentioned climate change. I got to be honest. I don't fully understand the climate change paranoia, which is a big one. There's a lot of people who are like, I'm not having kids because of climate change. I mean, they're making major life decisions based on climate change, and I actually think the climate is changing. Well, humans are incredibly adaptable, and the idea that we can't adapt to the scenarios that are being laid out there, it just doesn't seem. The concern seems unrealistic relative to it. On the other hand, I do see why people would be skeptical of technology in some ways. In the early '90s, I never played the game, but there was a tabletop role playing game called Shadowrun. It was a cyberpunk game. It was basically a mashup of cyberpunk and magic. So it's like Dungeons and Dragons meets Neuromancer. And I read the novels, and I have all the novels that were written in the original sense. And the thing about it was sort of a dystopian, like all cyberpunk, kind of a dystopian future. And one of the ideas from cyberpunk, or from Shadowrun, was we will have tailored bioweapons that literally in labs they can create DNA coded to you specific virus agents that will kill you. I think we actually have that capability today. And, people say, COVID was a lab leak. We don't have to go back to that. But with this CRISPR and all this other stuff, we either have or are on the verge of being able to create tailored bioweapons that could do crazy things. These, things about like, sort of like, some pathogen got loose and killed all humanity, those kind of movies. That's not totally science fiction. I mean, I think it's certainly possible. And we're already thinking about how to deploy it against mosquitoes. We're going to create genetic modifications that will render all male mosquitoes sterile, so that we'll just wipe out mosquitoes off the face of the earth. If we can wipe out mosquitoes, we could wipe out human beings. That was one that got me. And again, AI seems to be the big one. Skynet. I don't think AI, as it exists, really is that sort of self-aware thing by any means. But nevertheless, it's not a completely irrational thing. The idea that we could create a computer whose internal logic leads to self-destruction. Again, it's probably a boomer author, Fred Saberhagen, wrote a science fiction series called the Berserker series, which was about that an ancient race of aliens had created these mechanical starships to be their warrior class, and it had turned on them, and it had killed everybody, and it just tries to extinguish all life. So I do think there's although I don't fully totally don't get it, I do think it's not completely irrational. Nuclear bombs were never going to wipe out all life on Earth. I think it's in retrospect, that's pretty clear that was never going to happen. But there are big risks of is it completely illegitimate to be worried about technology could, in fact, we could summon the demon, as they say.
Well, I don't think it's irrational to be worried about it. I mean, this is one of the. It's a couple things to say. One, I think you have to be really, before you're going to impose. I think you have to appreciate the importance of growth for the human species. and that needs to caution against, especially technologies that will inhibit growth. And we've been one of the implications of the 60s and 70s. We were way too good at stopping technologies that are good for growth, like energy production.
You're talking about
Um,
economic growth?
Economic growth, which
Yeah.
is ultimately population growth and
Yep.
civilizational growth. I want to get back on the Henry Adams curve. Isn't that there aren't technologies to be very concerned about? I think it's important to be rooted in science facts, not science fiction. So, for example, with AIs, like training a better and better frontier model is just simply not going to create AI sentience, right? It just isn't how
No,
models
it's not going to do
run.
that.
That being said, we were not that far off from being able to create AI agents, which are not sentient, which are not conscious or in any way, shape, or form. Think of them more like computer viruses or worms that nonetheless have. I mean, a computer worm is a self-replicating program, right? It's not sentient, but it can still cause lots of damage. So AI agents that are badly programmed, that get out of control, is definitely something that is possible. Um, I'm in the words of our friend John Stokes, like, I'm sort of a Chernobylist. Like, I don't think that we're gonna have extinction, but I think Chernobyl, like complex catastrophic accident, is very much within the realm of possibility. Bio is the area we need to actually be thinking about and worrying about. The now in some ways, it's not all bad, right? Um, President Obama prohibited NIH funding and gain of function. This is a really not well understood thing. Obama prohibited gain of function research from being funded. He did so
What's gain
because
of function for those who don't know that?
gain of function research is where you, in a laboratory environment, try to manipulate the natural selection, the artificial selection of a virus in order to propagate a virus or a pathogen in order to propagate certain um, uh, capacities, right? Which is going to be important for research, and you can use it on supposedly use it on vaccine research is the idea. And there's some evidence to suggest that this is the kind of thing that led to the COVID-19 pandemic as a lab leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. What's really not well understood about that ban, which was led by several Harvard epidemiologists, was that they were pushing for it because gain of function research is unnecessary. The reason why Fauci was so dedicated to it is because it was an important part of NIH's broader international development programs. Because basically, the only labs that have the time is gain of function research. The way the Wuhan lab does it is extremely labor intensive and completely unnecessary using modern genetic techniques. You don't need to. So, basically, to do gain of function, you do a wet lab process of replicating the virus hundreds of times in order to nudge it in the right direction. The reason the Harvard epidemiologist is saying this is dangerous, we don't need to do this, is because at Harvard, you just use gene engineering. You just use CRISPR to immediately get the effects that you want. You don't have to poke it through the gain of function process. The gain of function research is basically make work for third world scientists. That's sort of the dirty secret of this whole thing.
No, I didn't know.
So from a technical standpoint, a micro-targeted pathogen is maybe a little bit out of, it would take some research funding to pursue that pathway. But certainly gene editing pathogens. I mean, my sister's a molecular immunologist, and she does this kind of thing all the time. It's very trivially easy to sequence pathogens, to change them using CRISPR or other techniques to change their genetic makeup. So, we're not that far away from tailorable viruses. And it's a question of, and actually AI is going to make this easier. Ben Horowitz at an event last year said AI is going to do for biology what calculus does for physics. In other words, it's sort of mathematical principles that allow you to take an underlying theory and actuate it, actualize it in engineering. So that is the hope for AI. And that's,
So I guess
to my mind, the real danger of AI. The real danger we face right now is we are, right now, technological capability for biological modification greatly exceeds our moral or policy framework to control that.
Yeah. So it sounds like we do have reason to be worried. A little bit. At least somewhat,
I
some
think
level.
so. But
Yeah.
I think your worry has to be, and this is maybe if you want to talk about the article, that worry needs to be tracked, needs to focus on a specific harm. It needs to be definite pessimism, as it were, instead of indefinite pessimism.
Yeah.
And I think what I call in the article theological lab leaks is the way that legitimate technological worries glom onto specific apocalyptic scenarios, which really I argue, and I'm pulling on the Catholic philosopher Joseph Pieper, really emerged from the Christian understanding of the apocalypse.
Yeah. So that's a great pivot because Comment is basically kind of a Christian magazine.
Yep.
And so we're being talking about technology, but one of the things you do in the article, which I think is great, is sort of tie it back to the Christian underpinnings of Western culture, and particularly the traditional Christian view of sort of a linear narrative of history leading to an apocalypse and then the return of Christ. How does this Christian narrative play into the scenarios we've been discussing?
Yeah, so it's interesting. For civilizations prior to ours, um, technological development above us, and this is I'm pulling on Leo Strauss. Technological development above a certain level would just undermine the underpinnings of society and lead to catastrophe, and the cycle of history would sort of begin over again. And even before the Enlightenment and our modern notions of scientific progress, created a linear understanding of history, that view of history had already emerged in Christian thinking. Right, you can see very clearly in Augustine, in other words, of a history that follows very distinctive stages, leading to the New Jerusalem, the new heaven and the new earth. Now, and you could project it backwards to creation and the fall, etc. Right, and if you were raised in the evangelical world, at some point or another, you saw an end times timeline. I'm sure that had the whole the whole story laid out for you. Now, what's just interesting though is for Pieper, I mean, for Augustine, for any number of church fathers who were interested in these questions, there's a very distinctive narrative, right? There's 7 ages of the church, tied in the period of after Christ is we're in the 7th age. It will, or 6th or 7th age. There's some disagreement about this. It will end with the fall of the last dregs of the Roman Empire, and then it will lead to the sequence of what Pieper calls the catastrophe within history, right? The dominion of Antichrist, tribulation of the church, and then the parousia, the second coming, and then the new heaven and new earth, right? So it's a story with a lot of discrete elements to it. What Pieper argues, I mean, he's not the only one to make this case, right? There's a secularization of this philosophy of history to an idea of progress as a kind of logic of history leading ever higher to utopia, basically.
Like some kind of Hegelian type view.
Well, I mean, I think the Hegel, but also Kant, Marx. I think that there's the progressive view of history has this kind of implicit eschatology to it. And what Pieper says is that the atomic bomb, or you could say the First and Second World Wars, reopen the possibility of a catastrophe within history. And that now, I mean, if you look at our discussion about where is the future going, what's remarkable about it is how suspended it is between visions of catastrophe, climate change, population collapse, existential AI risk, and visions of utopia. We're gonna defeat death. Brian Johnson wants to defeat death. Elon Musk wants to multiplanetary civilization with Neuralink democracy, right? And it says that kind of we're stuck between catastrophe and new catastrophe, and I think that's part of the anxiety that characterizes our age.
Yeah, and this is where you used the term in there. I thought it was really interesting. Theological lab leak. Uh, what is that?
Well, it's people's notion that um, this, our fears, anxieties, feelings about the future are a secularized Christian eschatology, but in which there's independent elements of that form the Christian narrative have been sort of liberated from their context. That's the lab leak element,
Hmm.
right? So it's like if you're telling a story, if you're telling the story of Beauty and the Beast, right? It has characters. I have three daughters, so I watch it all the time. You've got Belle, you've got this is a Disney version, of course, but
Okay.
Belle, you've got the Beast, you've got the various, you've got Gaston, you've got the various, and you have the environments, right? There's a story to tell, but the story in which they all play a distinctive part, right? Um, what happens, with and Disney and its effort to forever draw upon its IP and sort of done this to itself, you know, what happens when you take those characters out of context? When you take this character of the Beast and transplant him to I don't know
Hmm.
Paris in the 1930s or something, you can imagine sort of pulling these things out of context, and what it would do would be it would destroy the underlying meaning of the fable that emerges from the structure of all these elements placed together. So in our context, right, you have notions like, what is Skynet? What is the kind of Skynet nuclear catastrophe called in the Terminator movies?
No, I
Judgment
don't know.
Day.
Judgment Day. Yeah, yeah,
Judgment Day. So you have Judgment
yeah.
Day. You've got a notion of Antichrist, which Peter Thiel's been talking about more recently. You have an apocalypse, an Armageddon, a nuclear Armageddon, AI Armageddon, doesn't matter, Armageddon. You've got this dream of a new Jerusalem or a new heaven and a new earth, right? So you have all these elements, and they're all pulled out of context, and they're just floating around, and they are they sort of haunt our dreams, so to speak.
Hmm.
But it's in part because it was a story that, whether you believe it or not, only makes sense as a discrete story. You should either accept the Christian apocalypse, or you should reject it entirely and think you just have to. We don't know what the future's going to be like. We have to deal with it scientifically, whatever that means. But what you shouldn't do is allow it to just sort of float around and haunt you. It's kind of an interesting example of what Mark Fisher calls hauntology,
Hmm.
of the way in which our dreams of the future are sort of,
Hauntology. Yeah,
are sort
I
of
like that.
um, haunted by our present is haunted by a future that isn't, or that refuses to be. It's sort of a version of that.
I, we're all shaped by this world that we live in, and these decontextualized elements are part of the culture. They're what shape us. How would a proper understanding of Christian eschatology and the idea of an apocalypse and the return of Christ and the New Jerusalem, how does that help us live, or should it help us live in this world that we're in, which is very uncertain and in some respects technologically unprecedented?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, um, the reason I'm so enamored of the Pieper book that I draw a lot from for this essay, the book's called uh, "The End of Time: A Meditation on Philosophy of History," is he makes the claim that that paradoxically this apocalyptic fable or prophecy, he calls it, has been a great power of building and founding for Christians. It's actually led Christians to build institutions that endure over time, paradoxically. And so exploring why that is sort of one of the kind of subtext of the essay. Um, I mean, I think that the essay does well. The adopting a Christian notion of the apocalypse, I think, does two things. One, helps clarify that the relationship between catastrophe and eucatastrophe. It says there will be a catastrophe.
For
There
people who
will
don't know, what is
be
a
destruction.
eucatastrophe? What
It's
is
just
a
a good catastrophe. So
okay?
when we think about catastrophe, it's like a surprising, destructive
Right.
end, and a eucatastrophe is where you expect catastrophe and find instead. There's a great. This is
Is
a
that,
bit
is
of a
that from
spoiler.
C.S. Lewis? I think is that from C.S.
I
Lewis
don't know
or
where it's. I don't know if it's from C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, the
Um,
eucatastrophe idea. Who invented that idea?
apparently J.R.R. Tolkien
Oh,
in the
Tolkien,
1944
not
essay
C.S.
on
Lewis.
fairy
Tolkien.
tales.
Yeah, Tolkien. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Interesting. Yeah. Tolkien's a deep thinker.
I got that wrong. I thought it
There's
was Lewis
there's
was
a
Tolkien.
it's a bit of a spoiler for the Michael what's his face? I don't know why I'm blanking on his name. He did Wall Street, main character, Michael Douglas.
Michael
Michael Douglas
Douglas. Yeah.
movie, The Game. I think it's 2000 or 1999. Amazing, prescient movie for understanding where society is going in the digital era. Highly recommend it. Spoiler, so skip this section if you really want to go watch it. There's a scene at the end where, through a series of machinations, he despairs. Like his father had committed suicide. It's haunted him all his life. He's this sort of successful businessman type figure. By the end of what appears to be a kind of game gone wrong, he believes he's killed his brother, and he commits suicide. He jumps off of the roof of a building down. There's a kind of glass atrium below, and then he smashes through the atrium, and underneath it is a giant like stunt pillow that catches him, and a bunch of people come in and clear this fake glass away, and he's at his 60th birthday party or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually all part of this game that he thought had gone awry. And it frees him from helps free him from being haunted by sort of his father's suicide. And that's a great example of a eucatastrophe.
Okay, great.
And that is, what it's mysterious, I think. And actually, Rene Girard, I haven't written very much about this. Rene Girard has a lot to say about these questions as well. Christians believe that history will end not with a whimper but a bang, so to speak, you might say. So that should give us hope, and this is something that there's a bigger story here. It's not all in vain. But the question is, what do we do in the meantime? And I think that's where what the essay addresses, which is being certain of the coming catastrophe should underlines the urgency of doing what everyone can today to prepare for it and to fend off evil that comes our way. So rather than because you think about it, this is the problem that the AI experts people have. If you have a particular discrete notion of a catastrophe that you, by your own agency, can avoid, you become obsessed with these sort of forking paths of potential futures, which concatenate unexpectedly, and it leads to ever greater anxiety. If you feel actually what the bad outcome is going to be, it's coming, then you can prepare for it. I mean, you see this with hurricanes, right? By far the worst outcomes you get in hurricanes are where people didn't prepare because they were surprised, right? Or they were uncertain. It could go here, it could go there. I'm gonna roll the dice, and you end up on the wrong side of the dice. The more certain a catastrophic forecast is, the better people prepare, and actually the better the outcome is in the end. Joseph Ratzinger calls this watchfulness. And it's interesting, right? In the book of Matthew, I talk about this in the essay. Immediately after Christ gives his apocalyptic teaching, where he talks about the destruction of the temple, the need for Christians to flee, prophesies his return, he immediately gives two parables about wicked and faithful servants who are anticipating an event that they're not certain of the timing of. And the moral of which is a kind of prepared watchfulness, neither anxiety nor that leads to paralysis or kind of just believing that this is going to happen. A surety, trusting that this will happen, and then actually going and preparing for that.
Yeah, and so I guess maybe there's not a theological answer to this question, but practically in terms of how we approach technology specifically today, what are the implications of that?
I mean, I think don't be afraid of it. Maybe some people disagree with me on this, but frankly, I think don't fear it. Don't fear that it will override God's, God is the author of history. Take action now to use it for the good and to fight against its uses for the evil, or to develop technologies that support Christian vision of human flourishing to fight against those that are damaging to it. Um, I think continue to build institutions that live out the gospel. Um, I think that's one of the ways the Christians can go wrong. In the first century, in the 13th century, in the 20th century, there have been sort of these millenarian cults where the whole theme is like, it's going to happen. Christ is going to come back now, so sell all your stuff and let's just and let's just sit around waiting for the rapture to happen or whatever. And I think that is completely not what we're supposed to do. I think preparing for the Lord's return means continuing to be faithful in the task that He's given us. That's the parable of the talents.
I want to drill in one area specifically, and then maybe we'll wrap up. And that's going back to the area of biotechnology.
Mm-hmm.
Several years ago, I got invited to a conference, and they asked us to fill out these forms with our opinions on a bunch of things. And it was like, well, we're going to maybe make what people say available to the people anonymously. And I can't remember what the exact question was. Was this essentially like, what's the greatest danger of technology or something like that? And I said that I thought the most dangerous was the idea of the loss of the sense of the human as a sacred being. And a lot of people reacted, or some people reacted very negatively to that publicly in the conversations. And when I look at the biomedical stuff, and I see this like incredible desire for transhumanism, but I really see this like, we need to upload our brain into a computer. We need to alter the human being. We need to become cyborgs. I don't know that, some dystopia, we're not all going to become Cybermen or something like that. At the same time, there's something deeply troubling to me about the idea of tinkering with human life at that level. And yeah, I get it. Like, oh, we cured cystic fibrosis. If you didn't know, we cured cystic fibrosis. It's astonishing that what we're doing is allowing things that were death sentences and debilitating. It's wonderful. At the same time, it feels like we're, to me, it's not like in the Matrix where we played with God by playing with AI. That's how we imagined ourselves to be God. Now we imagine ourselves to be God by changing humanity's basic biological reality of existence. And I'm curious what you think of that practically, like just in general, and like practically, how would a Christian think about something like that today? Knowing that you're a political scientist, not a theologian.
Yep. Not a theologian, not a bioethicist, but I think I do think about this. I mean, one classic thing bioethicists talk about is a restoration of function versus a transformation of function. Restoration of health as opposed to you trying to achieve some kind of strange new potential with technology. Because in the former, you are treating the human as the template. You're actually trying to restore the human. The other, you're trying to, in some ways, obliterate or transcend the template of the human. I mean, it's certainly how I feel about it. It's one of those things that it can be quite difficult to argue about. I think another notion that I've been thinking a lot about is Illich's notion of hope versus expectation. Hope is in kind of the orientation.
About Ivan Illich, the Catholic radical priest. Yeah, the Catholic radical priest. Very great guy. Look him up.
Yeah, very, very interesting reading. The hope as the idea of the orientation towards the receipt of a gift, an expectation as the controlled outcome of a process that I initiate. And I think just yesterday in my my wife is part of a number of Facebook groups. One of them has a lot of a lot of her sort of peers, moms, many of which are moms now, And there's a woman who posted in this group saying that she and her husband had done IVF and had to use IVF for their second, and now they were going for a third. With their third, they ended up having twins, which is a very common, and
Yep.
much less than it used to be, but still common outcome of IVF. And they were very seriously considering, what is euphemistically called a reduction, in other words, aborting one of the twins. So they'll three instead of four, and I was struck by the thought that at least until very recently, maybe young people today, unfortunately, aren't even shaped in this environment. But at least a generation ago, I think it's almost impossible to imagine somebody who had conceived the twins naturally even thinking about the possibility of aborting one of them.
Yeah, you're
And
right.
yet, if you are having twins because you've done IVF, there's a sense of like this isn't the outcome that I paid for. I'm expecting a certain kind of outcome, and this complicates that outcome, and it becomes possible to think, reducing, aborting one of the twins or two of the triplets or something, one of the triplets, in order to kind of achieve the family that I've paid to achieve. Um, I think my worries about biotech come from, in many cases, it's quite hard to pin down in like a specific personal individual case. Why is this so troubling? But when you zoom out and you look at how does this reshape society, how does this reshape how we think about ourselves, with real serious political, cultural, economic implications, then it becomes much clearer. Another example is MAID, right? You can come the
Canadian
medical
assisted
assistance,
suicide, basically. Yeah.
medical
Medical
assistance in
assistance in
dying,
dying. Yeah.
yeah, Canadian suicide, euthanasia. In many individual cases, it seems it's one has a lot of enormous amount of sympathy with somebody who's enduring a terminal illness that's a huge burden on their families, of which there's no hope of recovery, which results in significant degradation of their condition toward the end, something like that. It's possible to have real sympathy for this. But you zoom out, like, what does this do to a society that embraces this view of death? And the results are absolutely horrifying.
Yeah. They
Um,
basically, the public health officials, the medical people basically encourage you to kill yourself because they don't want to pay to treat you.
that's right. Yeah, and that was basically a predictable outcome of this.
Yeah.
So I think at least amongst Protestants, Protestants I think have a very biblicist view of ethics, right? The Bible is God's word, and so we try to many Protestants try to kind of root ethical principles in some biblical thing, and you can do some of that for bioethics, but I think we've really got to embrace this more comprehensive sort of social ethics approach to understanding the effects of some of these technologies and thinking carefully about them.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, to me, this is the one that I just find it again the most troubling way to think about it. And it just seems weird that like we can, maybe it's like I'm worried. Maybe I've read too much science fiction and I'm worried about those tailored bioweapons. But there is this thing where like the Bible says we're actually going to get transhumanist bodies, and it says we're going to get new bodies. We don't know what we're going to look like. Maybe it's not
Yep.
totally new. It'll still be us. But we don't know what we will yet be, it says. And so there is a sense in like all the limitations that we have today, the people who are suffering today, they're not going to be suffering in the age to come. And so we're already going to get something great and perfect. And this idea that I need to create that now. There is a certain like, I need to be the God that does this. But of course, as I can say, I can understand why people say, well, God wanted you to die of this thing that we could easily cure, penicillin. It's very easy to rationalize something
Yep.
like that. But this is the one that I find, to me, I find it the most troubling because it really is, in a sense, people who want to play God. And I noticed like in that conversation, people are extremely sensitive and reactive about any sense that there could be anything possibly wrong with this. And I find it weird. I don't know. To me, the transhumanism idea
Hmm.
is one it's not, because transhumanism basically says that I get to play God. I can be God. There's a certain a sense of that that I don't. I'm just an old fogey, but I'm troubled by that.
Yeah, so there was a and my friend and colleague Brian Chow pointed this out. There was this British, radical leftist who I think in like a TEDx talk type thing proposed genetically modifying humans so they can no longer process red meat to save the climate.
Yeah.
Instead of course, just like doing like geoengineering or decarbonization, other things. So like whatever my politics is the opposite of whatever that is.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Like if you want we gotta resist transhumanism. We gotta do it through building good technologies that affirm our natures and help us live better within our natures. So I don't think again, it's not a matter of like, do you like technology or not? And this is something I really don't like about a certain kind of Silicon Valley person is they have this extremely simplistic black and white view of like you like technology or you're against technology. But I think the world is a lot more complex than that. I think it's which technologies support human flourishing.
Yeah. Well, Jon, thank you so much. Again, Jon Askonas has been my guest today. He's a professor of politics at Catholic University. He wrote a great article called, I'll make sure I get the title right, Building a Future in the Face of Apocalypse, which talks a lot about technology and how to do it. There's a link to that in the show notes. Jon, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Aaron.